The rain hit the reinforced glass of the ER bay like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry child. It was a percussive, relentless static that usually drowned out the low-frequency hum of the ventilation. But tonight, inside Trauma 1, the only sound that mattered was the wet, gurgling failure of an airway collapsing. I stood against the back wall, my hands clasped behind me to hide the tremor. It wasn't fear. It was the dull, grinding spike of fire between my L4 and L5 vertebrae, the range attacks. It always came due when the barometric pressure dropped. I shifted my weight to my left leg, locking the knee, turning my body into a tripod to keep upright without wincing. Pain was just data. It was the body's check engine light. You didn't panic. You just noted the circuit. On the gurney, Mrs. Gable was drowning in her own fluids. She was 72, a VIP donor, with a difficult neck and a mouth full of expensive porcelain veneers. Dr. Pound. Bryce stood over her, his knuckles white around the handle of a Macintosh laryngoscope. He was sweating. The curved blade was meant to slide into the vallecula and lift the tissue indirectly, but Bryce was using it like a crowbar. He was fighting geometry, and geometry was winning. The smell of copper fresh blood cut through the antiseptic air. He had nicked the gingiva. Again. Suction. Bryce barked, his voice cracking an octave higher than his usual arrogance. I can't see the cords. Why is there so much blood? Sarah, the junior nurse, fumbled with the Yankow tip. Her hands were shaking. The suction canister bubbled with bright red froth. On the monitor, the numbers were turning from a warning yellow to a critical red. SpO2 was 88, then 85. The rhythmic beep-beep-beep of the cardiac monitor began to accelerate, a digital countdown to brain death. I watched Bryce's mechanics. He was panicked. Tunnel vision had set in. He was fixating on the obstacle, the tongue, the blood, rather than the path. He leaned back, leveraging the blade against Mrs. Gable's upper incisors. I heard the sickening click of steel against ceramic. Don't leverage. Lift. The thought was automatic, a muscle memory from a life I had buried 10 years ago. Doctor, I said. My voice was low, flat, designed to cut under the noise of the rain. Saturation is 80. Heart rate is 120. She's entering the bradycardic window. I know the numbers, Vera, Bryce snapped, not looking up. He adjusted his grip, digging deeper. Her anatomy is impossible. Anterior airway. Get me the glidescope. Now. We didn't have time for a glidescope. The hypoxia was already shutting down the electrical pathways in Mrs. Gable's heart. I saw the fasciculations ripple under her pale skin. The succinylcholine had paralyzed her muscles, but without oxygen, that paralysis was a tomb. Bryce was killing her. Not out of malice, but out of the most dangerous thing in medicine. A bruised ego refusing to pivot. I pushed off the wall. The pain in my lower spine flared hot, but I boxed it away. I moved into the sterile zone, stepping into Bryce's personal space. I didn't ask. I didn't suggest. I simply reached out and placed my hand firmly on his wrist. Stop, I said. Bryce froze, shocked by the physical contact. What are you doing? Get back. You're breaking her teeth, and you're missing the landmark. I stripped the bloody Macintosh blade from the handle with a sharp snap and dropped it onto the tray. It clattered like a dropped weapon. In one fluid motion, I grabbed the Miller 3-blade straight steel, designed for this exact anatomy. I clicked it onto the handle. The light flared white. Cricoid pressure, I ordered Sarah. She obeyed instantly, pressing her thumb and forefinger against the patient's throat to close off the esophagus. I stepped into the slot. I didn't leave her. I inserted the straight blade, bypassing the tongue, sliding deep until I caught the tip of the epiglottis itself. I lifted, not back, but up and forward, towards the junction of the ceiling and the far wall, a 45-degree vector. There. The vocal cords appeared a white, triangular V amidst the red chaos, a perfect target. Tube. Sarah slapped the endotracheal tube into my palm. I guided it through the cords. No hesitation, no friction. I watched the black line of the cuff pass the vocal folds. I inflated the pilot balloon. "Bag her," I said, stepping back. Sarah squeezed the ambu bag. Whoosh! Mrs. Gable's chest rose symmetrically. The numbers on the monitor paused, then began the slow, beautiful climb back to 90. The room exhaled. The adrenaline crash hit the team, shoulders slumping, breaths catching. But Dr. Bryce didn't slump. He stiffened. He looked at the monitor, then at the intact teeth, then at me. The realization that a nurse had just saved him from a malpractice suit didn't bring gratitude. It brought rage. "You crossed a line," Bryce hissed, stepping close enough that I could smell his stale coffee breath. "You physically interfered with an attending physician. That is grounds for immediate termination." The rain hammered harder against the glass. I let my shoulders round forward. I dulled my eyes. I put the mask back on. "I'm sorry, doctor," I mumbled, staring at his shoes. I was careless. I just saw the saturation dropping and I panicked. "It won't happen again." "Damn right it won't," he spat, adjusting his tie, reclaiming his territory. "Clean this mess up." He turned away. I didn't listen to his muttering. My eyes had drifted past him, to the wall behind his shoulder, the pressure gauge for the main oxygen line. The needle didn't flicker. It dropped. It fell from 50 psi to 0 in a dead freefall. That wasn't a leak. Physics doesn't move that fast unless a line is severed. My hand went to my left wrist. 2 fingers found my radial artery. Thump, 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 55 beats per minute. Steady. I looked past the gauge, through the open doors of the trauma bay, toward the elevators. A figure was moving there. A man in grey maintenance coveralls pushing a large cart. He didn't run. He walked with a distinctive heavy rhythm weight rolling from the heel to the outer edge of the foot. A rolling gait. Efficient. Tactical. The elevator doors closed on him just as the hiss of the ventilators died out completely. Most people think a hospital is a place of healing. It's not. It's a machine designed to keep biology in check using electricity and gas. And the engineer had just pulled the plug. We moved out of the trauma bay and into the main artery of the 4th floor. The transition was jarring. Behind us, the ER was a controlled chaos of alarms and shouting. Here, the hallway stretched out like a throat, dim and unnervingly quiet. The storm outside had turned the windows into sheets of black water, the rain hammering against the glass with a rhythm that felt like static interference in my skull. Overhead, a bank of fluorescent lights flickered a dying ballast buzzing like an angry hornet. Buzzed. Dark. Buzzed. Light. The strobe effect made the long stretch of linoleum look like a series of disconnected photographs. "I'm filing a formal incident report," Bryce muttered, walking 2 steps ahead. He was marching, his heels striking the floor hard, broadcasting his location to anyone with ears. He was trying to outwalk his embarrassment. "You undermined my authority, Vera. You put this hospital at risk." Sarah trailed behind him, hugging a stack of charts to her chest, as if they were body armor. She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes, sensing the tension but not understanding the danger. The air here felt thin, stale. The HVAC system had stopped humming. Without the white noise of the blowers, the silence underneath the rain was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. "Are you listening to me?" Bryce spun around, his voice echoing off the tile walls. I said, "Shh," I whispered. I didn't stop walking, but I shifted my weight, softening my footfalls from a heel strike to a mid-foot roll. Silent. "Don't you shush me," Bryce started, his face flushing red. I held up a hand. My focus narrowed. The pain in my lower back faded into background noise as my auditory cortex went into overdrive. I filtered out the rain. I filtered out Bryce's heavy breathing. I filtered out the distant squeak of a janitor's cartwheels. I was hunting for the anomaly. And then I heard it. Click, clack. It was faint, coming from the north wing. Near the elevators I had seen the maintenance man enter. It wasn't the metallic clank of a bedrail dropping. It wasn't the hollow thud of a dropped chart. It was a distinctive, two-part mechanical sound. Precision-machined steel sliding on oiled rails, the slide of a semi-automatic weapon being racked. My brain tried to reject it. "You're a nurse," it argued. "This is a hospital." But the ranger inside me, the one who had spent 3 tours listening for ghosts in the dark, knew better. That sound didn't belong to medicine. It belonged to ballistics. I didn't think. The OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act, short-circuited, straight to action. "Move," I hissed. I lunged past Sarah, my hand slapping the master light switch on the wall near the nurse's station. The flickering fluorescence died instantly. The corridor plunged into a grey, watery darkness, lit only by the ambient stormlight from the windows. "What the hell?" Bryce began. I grabbed him by the lapel of his expensive lab coat and shoved him hard to the right. He stumbled, his feet tangling. I didn't let him fall. I hooked Sarah's arm with my other hand, my grip tight enough to bruise, and dragged them both into the open alcove of the supply closet. "Get down," I ordered. Not a request, but a command. I kicked the door shut, leaving it cracked just an inch. I forced Bryce into a crouch behind a stack of saline boxes and pressed my hand over his mouth before he could protest. His eyes bulged in the dark, white rims of panic, visible in the gloom. I pressed a finger to my own lips, staring at him with an intensity that promised violence if he made a sound. My heart rate was steady. 60 beats. The nurse mask was gone. For 3 seconds, there was only the sound of Sarah's terrified, shallow breathing and the rain. Then, the building answered. Thud. A heavy, magnetic slam echoed from the far end of the hallway. It was the sound of a fire door engaging a 300-pound steel plate being seized by an electromagnet. Thud. Another one. Closer. The exits to the stairwell. Thud. The main double doors to the waiting room. We weren't just in the dark. We were being sealed in. Someone wasn't just locking the doors, they were compartmentalizing the floor, turning the hospital into a grid of isolated cages. The maintenance man hadn't just cut the air. He was welding the lid on the jar. Bryce pulled my hand away from his mouth, trembling. "What? What is that? Is it a drill?" "No," I said, my voice barely a breath, watching the slice of darkness through the crack in the door. "Drills don't rack slides." I looked at the gap between the door and the frame. The red LED on the electronic lock outside turned from green to solid, unblinking red. Access denied. We were trapped, and we were not alone. "Stay here," I whispered, my mouth barely an inch from Bryce's ear. "If you make a sound, we die." Bryce opened his mouth to argue, his face a pale mask in the gloom, but I didn't wait for his objection. I slipped out of the supply closet and let the door click shut, engaging the latch with a softness that felt louder than a gunshot. I was alone in the corridor now. The hospital had transformed. 10 minutes ago, this was a place of healing, a sterile ecosystem of charts and saline drips. Now, stripped of its hum and its lights, it was just a kill box, a grid of fatal funnels and blind corners. My back flared L4, complaining about the crouch, but I pushed the pain into a mental lockbox. I rolled my shoulders, shedding the posture of the tired, middle-aged nurse. My center of gravity dropped. My breathing shifted. Deep, rhythmic, silent. The ghost wasn't a memory anymore. She was the operating system coming back online. I moved toward the north wing, sticking to the wall where the shadows were deepest. The rain still lashed the windows, but inside, the air was dead still. I wasn't patrolling, I was hunting. I needed to know the variables. How many? What gear? And most importantly, what were their rules of engagement? I stopped at the corner of the nursing station, using the reflection in a darkened glass partition to peer around the bend. There, 50 feet down, a beam of light swept across the floor. It wasn't the frantic searching of a security guard. It was methodical. Tight arc. Weapon mounted. The figure behind the light was tall, dressed in dark grey fatigues, moving with a lazy confidence that terrified me more than aggression. He wasn't scared of getting caught. He owned the floor. He carried a suppressed carbine short barrel, probably a SIG slung tight against his chest. On his shoulder, a radio chirped with static, the volume turned low. He was an infection. In aviation, we call it FOD, foreign object debris, a loose bolt on a runway that can shred a jet engine. In medicine, it's a pathogen. You don't negotiate with pathogens, you sterilize them. My hand went to my pocket, fingers closing around the cold plastic of the 10-milliliter syringe I had swiped from the crash cart. Succinylcholine, a nectin, a paralytic agent used for rapid sequence intubation. It doesn't put you to sleep. It just disconnects the brain from the muscle. I calculated the dosage. 100 milligrams. Enough to drop an elephant. He was approaching the linen chute, a perfect fatal funnel. No cover. Nowhere to turn. I didn't wait for him to see me. I waited for him to commit to the turn. As his boot heel cleared the threshold of the linen bay, I moved. I didn't run. Running is noisy. I accelerated in a smooth, low glide, crossing the 10 feet of linoleum in 2 heartbeats. He sensed the displacement of air. He started to turn, the carbine barrel swinging left. Too late. My left hand clamped over his mouth, driving his head back into my shoulder to expose the neck. At the same time, my right hand drove the needle down. I didn't aim for the delicate veins of the arm. I went for the jugular, punching through the sternocleidomastoid muscle. He bucked. A violent spasm of pure muscle, slamming me back against the wall. My spine screamed. I gritted my teeth and thumbed the plunger. Hiss. 10 milliliters of liquid fire flooded his system. He tried to shout, but my hand was a vice. He tried to bring the gun up, but I hooked my leg behind his knee and drove my weight forward. We collapsed together, not with a crash, but with a heavy, muffled thump. I rode him down, pinning his gun arm with my knee, keeping the pressure on his mouth. "Shh," I whispered, staring into his wide, panicked eyes. "It's just medicine." It took 45 seconds for the anectine to achieve full saturation. First came the fasciculations. It's a side effect of the depolarizing blocker. His muscles didn't just go limp, they danced. Ripples of uncontrollable twitching rolled under the skin of his face and neck, like thousands of worms writhing beneath the surface. It was a chaotic biological storm as every neuron fired one last time before silence. Then, the stillness. The twitching stopped instantly. His body went slack, dead weight against me, but his eyes were wide open. That's the horror of succinylcholine. It's not an anesthetic. He was fully awake. He could see me. He could feel my knee on his chest. He could feel the terror of his own lungs refusing to draw air, but he couldn't blink. He couldn't twitch a finger. He was a consciousness, trapped in a corpse. Locked in. I watched his pupils dilate as the hypoxia set in. I didn't look away. I owed him that much. When the light finally faded from his eyes, I checked his pulse. 0. I stripped the radio from his vest and took the carbine, though I had no intention of firing it. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my brow. The corridor was silent again, but the air felt heavier. 1 down. But pathogens never come alone. The silence that followed the death was heavier than the noise of the struggle. The guard lay at my feet, a dark shape against the linoleum, his eyes still fixed in that final locked-in stare. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the cold, pragmatic necessity of the moment. He was no longer a threat. He was a resource cache. I knelt, ignoring the spike of protest from my lumbar spine. The smell of the corridor had changed. Underneath the metallic tang of the rain and the floor wax, there was something else sharp, acrid like ozone or ionized air. It was the smell of a welding torch just extinguished. I patted him down, my movements efficient, searching for intel, not wealth. No wallet, no ID, just a tactical radio clipped to his vest. I unclipped it and held it to my ear. There was no chatter, just a rhythmic, low-frequency static that pulsed in time with the flickering emergency lights. Crust. Click. Crust. It wasn't a communication channel. It sounded like a telemetry stream. Data, not voice. I reached into his vest pocket, and my fingers brushed against stiff paper. I pulled it out. It was a single sheet, folded into a tight square. I didn't open it immediately. I moved back into the shadows of the alcove, shielding the beam of my penlight with my palm. I unfolded the paper. It wasn't a map of the exits. It wasn't a list of high-value drugs or a dossier on wealthy patients. It was a schematic. The header read, Facility Infrastructure Zone, 4 Medical Gas Distribution Manifold. My brow furrowed. I traced the lines with my thumb. This was the plumbing of the hospital's life support systems. Blue lines for oxygen, yellow for medical air, grey for vacuum. It was a labyrinth of copper piping that ran through the ceiling plenums, feeding the wall outlets in every patient room. But someone had modified this drawing. Red marker ink slashed across the diagram. The main shut-off valves for the north and south wings were crossed out, but the bypass valves, the high-pressure regulators that stepped the tank pressure down from 2000 psi to the safe 50 psi used at the bedside, were circled. Next to the circles, someone had scrawled a calculation in neat block handwriting. P1 is greater than P, limit equals adiabatic failure. This wasn't a robbery plan. This was an engineering schematic for a catastrophic system failure. The data clicked into place, forming a terrifying picture. In the military, we learned about thermobaric weapons, fuel-air explosives. They work by dispersing a cloud of fuel into the atmosphere and then igniting it. The result isn't just an explosion. It's a pressure wave that liquidates internal organs and sucks the oxygen out of the air. Hospitals don't have fuel clouds, but they have thousands of gallons of pure, compressed oxygen. I looked at the red circles again. If you bypass the regulators, you push high-pressure gas into low-pressure pipes. The friction of the gas rushing into the valves creates heat, immense, instant heat. It's called adiabatic compression. If there's even a trace of grease or oil in those pipes, the oxygen doesn't just leak, it auto-ignites. And if you saturate a sealed floor with pure oxygen, you don't need a bomb. The air itself becomes the explosive. A gunshot, a spark from a taser, even the static from a wool blanket could trigger it. The plan wasn't to take hostages. It was to turn the 4th floor into a hyperbaric chamber, primed to incinerate everything biological inside it. I lowered the paper, my hand trembling slightly. This wasn't the work of a thug. The guard I had just killed was a pawn. The mind behind this, the man I had seen with the rolling gate, was an engineer. He wasn't stealing from the system. He was judging it. Radical accountability. He was proving that the hospital's own infrastructure was a death trap, and he was going to use us as the crash test dummies. Then I heard it. It started as a whisper, then grew to a low, serpentine sound coming from the ceiling tiles above my head. Hiss. It wasn't the ventilation. It was the sound of gas moving at velocity. The pressure in the lines was rising. The manifold was being overridden. I looked down at the dead guard, then back up at the dark ceiling. The timeline had just collapsed. We didn't have hours. We had minutes before the saturation reached the flashpoint. I had to find the manifold room. I had to find the architect. And I had to stop him before he lit the match. I slipped back into the supply closet, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind me. The air inside was hot, recycled and sour with the smell of unwashed terror. Sarah was huddled in the corner between a stack of IV fluids in the mop sink, her knees pulled to her chest. But Bryce was on his feet. He was pacing the 3-foot clearance, vibrating with a manic, kinetic energy that made my skin crawl. His tie was loose, his lab coat stained with sweat. He looked less like a chief of surgery and more like a trapped animal chewing on the bars of its cage. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice pitching up. "I've been waiting 10 minutes. This is insane. We can't stay in here." He reached for the door handle. His hands were shaking so bad he fumbled the grip. "I'm going out there," he stammered, his eyes darting around but refusing to land on mine. "I'm going to talk to them. I'm a senior administrator. They want money? Fine. They want drugs? Fine. I can authorize it. We just need to negotiate." I stood still, blocking his path. I didn't see a doctor anymore. I saw a leak. I saw a noise discipline violation waiting to happen. In a siege, panic is contagious. It's a pathogen. And Dr. Bryce was patient zero. "Step away from the door, Bryce," I said. My voice was low, stripped of any deference. "No, doctor. Just the name." He stopped, blinking at the tone. Then the indignation hit him. The reflex of a man who had spent 20 years being the most powerful person in every room he walked into. "Excuse me?" He drew himself up, trying to summon the ghost of his authority. "I am the chief of surgery, Vera. I am your superior. I am ordering you to move aside so I can resolve this situation before you get us all killed with your cowboy hysterics." He shouted the last part. The sound bounced off the tile walls, loud enough to penetrate the door, loud enough to echo down the hallway where the architect was pressurizing the lines. He grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging into my scrub top, trying to shove me out of the way. "Move!" he screamed. My assessment was instant. In triage protocol, a patient who is screaming is usually a green tag walking wounded, but a patient whose panic threatens the unit. That's a threat. That's a black tag. I didn't argue. I didn't explain the thermobaric bomb. You don't debate physics with a man drowning in his own ego. You just remove the variable. I reacted with the muscle memory of a ranger, not a nurse. As he pushed, I didn't resist. I yielded. I stepped deep into his guard, my left foot hooking behind his right ankle. I grabbed his wrist with one hand and his lapel with the other, using his own forward momentum against him. Osotogari. Major outer reap. I pivoted and drove him down. Thud. It wasn't a gentle takedown. I slammed him onto the linoleum floor with enough force to knock the wind out of his lungs. His head cracked against the tile, not enough to fracture, but enough to stun. My lower back screamed in protest. A white-hot spike from 4, but I rode the pain. I dropped my knee squarely onto his solar plexus, pinning him with my full body weight. He gasped, eyes bulging, mouth opening to scream again. I didn't let him. I clamped my hand over his mouth and nose, my thumb digging into his cheekbones, sealing the airway. I leaned down, my face inches from his. The nurse mask was gone. The eyes staring back at him were dead, flat and absolute. He thrashed for a second, clawing at my arm, but I tightened the pressure on his chest until his ribs creaked. He froze. The realization hit him. He wasn't wrestling a middle-aged woman with a bad back. He was wrestling a predator. I waited until the fight left his eyes, replaced by a wet, primal fear. Then I removed my hand from his mouth, but kept my forearm pressed against his throat. "Listen to me," I whispered. The sound was softer than the rain, harder than the floor. In the OR, you are God. But here, you are a casualty. You are a liability. Keep your mouth shut and do exactly what I say, or I will sedate you myself. I held his gaze. I let him see the truth of it. I wasn't threatening him. I was diagnosing him. Do you understand? Bryce stared up at me, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes, mixing with the sweat on his temples. The hierarchy of the hospital had just been incinerated. He nodded, a jerky, broken motion. "Yes," he wheezed. Yes. I eased the pressure, but I didn't help him up. I stood, checking my pulse. 62. Steady. I looked at Sarah in the corner. She was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. But she wasn't looking at me like I was a monster. She was looking at me like I was the only thing standing between her and the dark. Stay down, I said. Both of you. We moved in a tight column. I took point, keeping my silhouette low against the wall. Bryce was in the middle, stripped of his arrogance, moving with the jerky compliance of a man who had surrendered his will. Sarah brought up the rear, her breathing audible but controlled. The hospital felt different now. The silence wasn't empty. It was pressurized. My head was starting to throb a sharp, high-altitude ache behind the eyes. The air tasted sweet, almost metallic. It was subtle, but to someone who had spent years monitoring blood gases, it was unmistakable. The oxygen levels in the hallway were climbing. Hyperoxygenation is a paradox. It makes your senses sharper. Colors look brighter. Sounds are crisper. But it's a toxic clarity. It lowers the flashpoint of everything around you. The cotton of our scrubs, the oil in the door hinges, the hair on our arms in this atmosphere, they were all waiting for an excuse to burn. We weren't walking through a hallway anymore. We were walking through the inside of a carburetor. Stay close, I whispered. My voice sounded too loud in the enriched air. The north exit is 50 yards ahead. If the maglocks are engaged, we break the glass on the manual override. It was a good plan. It was a logical plan. But the architect didn't deal in logic. He dealt in physics. We rounded the corner past the dialysis unit, and the smell hit me first. It wasn't the copper tang of blood or the sour reek of fear. It was chemical. Sharp. Electric. It smelled like a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle. The distinct, biting scent of ozone and vaporized metal. Then came the sound. Zzz. Crackle. Pop. It was a violent, tearing noise, like bacon frying in a pan, amplified 1,000 times. It echoed down the long concrete tunnel of the service corridor, bouncing off the hard surfaces. It wasn't the mechanical thud of a lock or the hiss of gas. It was energy. Raw, unshielded current. I threw up a hand, halting the column. Bryce bumped into my back, stifling a yelp. Eyes down, I hissed, shielding my own vision with a raised hand. Do not look at the light. At the far end of the hall, shadows were dancing. They weren't the soft yellow shadows of a flashlight. They were harsh, jagged shadows cast by a light source that pulsed with a blinding blue-violet intensity. It was an industrial strobe light, flickering with a malice that turned the sterile hospital walls into a dungeon. I crept forward alone, leaving Bryce and Sarah in the alcove of the linen room. I needed to see the threat before I could engage it. I peered around the final bend, squinting against the glare. The north exit was a set of heavy, double-steel doors. Standing in front of them was Cade. He looked like a monster dredged up from the deep sea. He was wearing a heavy leather apron over his coveralls and a blackened welding helmet that covered his entire face. In his hand, he held the stinger of an industrial stick welder, the thick cables snaking back to a portable generator cart that hummed beside him. He wasn't guarding the door. He was erasing it. He drew the electrode down the seam where the door met the frame. The arc struck a miniature supernova of white heat, burning at 6,000 degrees Celsius. Sparks cascaded around him in a shower of molten gold and blue. He wasn't just tack welding it shut. He was laying a continuous bead, fusing the steel of the door to the steel of the frame. He was turning the exit into a solid wall. I gripped the carbine I had taken from the dead guard, my finger hovering over the trigger, but I couldn't shoot. In an oxygen-enriched environment, the muzzle flash alone could trigger a flashover, and if I hit the acetylene tank on his cart, we would all be vaporized before our nerves even registered the heat. Cade finished the seam and lifted the mask. I pulled back instantly, pressing myself flat against the wall, heart hammering against my ribs. He didn't look around. He didn't check for witnesses. He just inspected his work with the detached precision of a craftsman. He ran a gloved hand over the cooling metal, checking for gaps. Finding none, he nodded once, lowered the mask, and dragged his equipment toward the stairwell door to repeat the process. The realization settled in my gut like lead. This wasn't a hostage situation. Hostage takers need exits. They need leverage. They need a way out. Cade didn't want a way out. He was sealing the vessel. He was turning the 4th floor into a hermetically sealed pressure cooker. Every vent taped. Every door welded. Every gap filled. We were trapped in a steel box, and he was slowly pumping it full of explosive gas. I moved back to Bryce and Sarah. Bryce looked at me, hopeful. "Did you open it? Can we go?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I struggled to keep the casualty mask in place. I felt the weight of the range attacks crushing my spine. "No," I said, my voice hollow. "The door isn't locked, Bryce. It's gone. We have to move. Now." We retreated from the welded doors into room 410. It was the only room on the north side, with a direct line of sight to the street. Inside, a terrified 10-year-old boy named Leo was hiding under his bedsheet, clutching a plastic dinosaur. Sarah rushed to him, whispering empty comforts, but I didn't have time for comfort. I went straight to the window. Below, the world had turned into a kaleidoscope of red and blue strobe lights. The perimeter was established. Armored bearcats were parked on the lawn, their heavy tires churning up the mud. A police helicopter circled overhead, its rotors cutting the air with a rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that vibrated against the glass. A blinding white spotlight swept across the building's facade, hunting for movement. Then I saw them. A stack of 6 operators in black tactical gear was moving along the adjacent roofline, preparing to rappel down to the 4th floor balcony. They moved with fluid, aggressive precision. They were the solution to a standard hostage crisis. But this wasn't standard. I watched their point man. He was focused entirely on the breach point, the balcony door. Target fixation. He saw a lock that needed breaking. He didn't see the invisible ocean of volatile gas he was about to swim through. I stepped back from the window, my lungs expanding too easily. The air in room 410 felt different than the corridor. It was colder here, sharper. It had a crisp quality to it, like standing on a mountain peak on a winter morning. It tasted sweet on the back of my tongue. To a layman, it feels refreshing. To a nurse, it's a warning siren. I looked at the pulse oximeter clipped to Leo's finger. It wasn't connected to the wall, but it was glowing. 100% saturation. Even Sarah, hyperventilating in the corner, had flushed pink cheeks. We were being saturated. The architect had bypassed the regulators completely. The pressure in the manifold was driving pure oxygen through every vent, displacing the nitrogen. Normal air is 21% oxygen. At 23%, fireproof materials become flammable. We were pushing past 25%. The room was no longer a shelter. It was the inside of a combustion chamber, waiting for a spark plug. My eyes snapped back to the SWAT team on the roof. The point man was unspooling a detonating cord, a linear shape charge designed to blow the hinges off a door. My stomach dropped. Physics is absolute. A breaching charge creates a high-velocity pressure wave and a flash of heat. In a normal environment, it just breaks wood and steel. But in a hyper-oxygenated environment, that flash triggers a chain reaction. The oxygen molecules don't just support combustion, they accelerate it to supersonic speeds. It wouldn't be a breach. It would be a thermobaric event. The explosion would consume all the oxygen in the room instantly, creating a vacuum that would implode the walls before the fireball even expanded. It would liquefy our internal organs. It would turn this entire wing of the hospital into a crater. They weren't coming to save us. They were coming to detonate us. I checked my pockets. No radio. No phone. The landline was dead. The glass was triple-paned, reinforced psychiatric glazing. I couldn't open it. I couldn't break it without risking a spark. I had to signal them. Analog, primitive, immediate. I looked around frantically for a marker, a pen, anything. Nothing. Just sterile surfaces and plastic toys. Then the pain in my back flared, reminding me of the body I inhabited. I looked at my arm. During the scuffle with Bryce, the IV port I had taped over earlier had been ripped loose. A thin trickle of dark venous blood was snaking down my forearm. Ink. I didn't hesitate. I stepped up to the cold glass, blocking the glare of the spotlight with my body. I raised my bleeding arm. I had to write backwards for them to read it. I had to visualize the letters flipping in my mind. M-O-O-B. No. B. O-O-M. I smeared my finger into the blood and pressed it against the window. It was thick, warm, and sticky. No breach. I wrote it large in jagged crimson block letters. The spotlight swept past, then snapped back, locking onto the window. The beam was blinding. I didn't flinch. I dipped my finger again, fighting the tremor in my hand, and wrote the reason below it. O2 leak. I stepped back, holding my bloody hand up, palm out. Stop. Outside, the point man on the roof froze. He tapped his headset. The stack paused. Please, read it. Do the math. I left Leo and Sarah in the patient room and moved deeper into the hospital's core. The imaging wing was different. The air here was always colder, the acoustics deadened by lead-lined walls and RF shielding. It felt less like a hospital and more like a submarine. I passed the yellow placard on the floor. Zone 3 restricted access, screening required. Beyond those double doors lay Zone 4, the magnet room. It housed a 3 Tesla wide-bore MRI scanner. Most people think of it as a camera. It is a superconducting electromagnet, cooled by liquid helium to near absolute zero. It is a monster that never sleeps. Even when the scanning sequence is off, the magnetic field is always on. It is always hungry for ferrous metal. I stopped at the threshold. My reflection was distorted in the observation window. I looked tired. L4 was screaming, but my mind was clear. Cade was coming. I could hear his heavy, rhythmic boots on the linoleum 3 corridors back. He was hunting, sweeping the floor room by room. He had the gun. He had the strength, but he didn't know the terrain. He saw a room. I saw a physics equation waiting to be balanced. I scanned the hallway for a weapon. Not a blade or a blunt object. I couldn't win a kinetic fight against a man his size. I needed to shape the battlefield. My eyes landed on the red cylinder mounted to the wall near the control room. A fire extinguisher, but not the standard dry chemical type found in the hallways. This was a CO2 extinguisher, specific for electrical fires in imaging suites. I grabbed it. It was heavy, the steel tank cold against my palm. Carbon dioxide doesn't just smother fire, it exits the nozzle at -78°C. It creates a dense, heavy fog as the gas expands and freezes the moisture in the air. I didn't pull the pin to aim at Cade. That would be a one-shot gamble. I needed something more permanent. I needed a blindfold. I moved to the doorway of the MRI suite. The floor was marked with bright yellow hazard tape and bold warnings. Danger. Permanent magnetic field. I raised the heavy tank and slammed the valve assembly against the steel doorframe. Clang. The safety pin sheared off. The handle bent. I pointed the black plastic horn down the hallway and squeezed the trigger mechanism. Hiss. The sound was violent, a high-pressure shriek that tore through the quiet wing. A jet of white gas erupted from the nozzle. It didn't rise like smoke. It sank. It rolled over the floor like a sentient avalanche, heavy and cold. Within 10 seconds, the corridor was transformed. The distinct, sterile lines of the hospital were erased, replaced by a churning sea of white vapor. It filled the space from the floor up to waist height, then chest height. I stepped back into the MRI room, into Zone 4. I tossed the empty canister into the corner plastic and aluminum. Non-ferrous, safe. The fog drifted into the room after me. swirling around the base of the massive, donut-shaped scanner. Crucially, it covered the floor. The yellow warning tape was gone. The bold text on the door was obscured by the mist. To an outsider, it looked like a pipe had burst. It looked like structural failure. It looked like chaos. I crouched behind the operator's console, shielded by the plastic casing. I slowed my breathing. I waited. The footsteps stopped. Through the observation glass, I saw a shadow emerge from the white gloom. Cade. He moved slowly, his silhouette hulking and distorted by the shifting fog. He held his 3D printed pistol in a low ready position, scanning left and right. The welding mask was gone, but he still wore the heavy leather apron. He paused at the threshold of the room. He looked at the billowing white cloud. He didn't see a trap. He saw a broken building. To an engineer, a gas leak fits the narrative of a failing system. It confirmed his bias. He stepped forward. His boot crossed the invisible line of Zone 4. He stepped right over the warning he couldn't see. He was now 10 feet from a magnet strong enough to pull a wheelchair through a brick wall, and he was holding a gun that contained steel springs, a steel barrel liner, and a steel slide. He took one more step, squinting into the dark room, hunting for me. "Come out," he rasped, his voice muffled by the fog. He tightened his grip on the gun. He had no idea he wasn't holding a weapon anymore. He was holding a lightning rod. Cade stepped through the fog. He was confident. He had the gun. He had the size. He had the arrogance of a man who believed he was the only engineer in the building. But he forgot the first rule of engineering. Respect the forces you cannot see. He crossed the yellow line. He entered the 5 Gauss line. Then, the 100 Gauss line. The air in the room didn't change. There was no hum, no vibration. The 3 Tesla magnetic field is silent. It is invisible, but it is absolute. It is 60,000 times stronger than the Earth's magnetic pull, focused into a tunnel the size of a coffin. I watched from behind the console, my heart rate steady at 65. I wasn't praying. I was counting the distance. 10 feet, 8 feet, 6 feet. He raised the gun. It was a polymer frame, 3D printed, ghost gun grey. He thought it was plastic. But a gun needs a firing pin. It needs a recoil spring. It needs a barrel liner. And it needs bullets. All of them were steel. All of them were ferrous. He was 5 feet from the bore when the physics equation balanced itself. It didn't happen in slow motion. It was instantaneous. 1 second, he was holding a weapon. The next, the weapon was alive. The magnetic field grabbed the steel components of the gun with a force of 2,000 pounds. It didn't just pull. It snatched. Crack. The sound was wet and sharp. The sound of phalanges snapping. Cade's finger was still inside the trigger guard when the gun accelerated from 0 to 40 miles per hour in a fraction of a second. The force broke his index finger backward, shattering the knuckle before ripping the weapon from his grip. The gun flew through the air like a missile, drawn straight into the center of the magnetic bore. Clang. It struck the inner wall of the scanner with the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. The impact was deafening. The plastic frame shattered, but the steel parts stayed pinned to the magnet, vibrating with kinetic energy. Cade screamed a raw, confused sound and clutched his mangled hand to his chest. He staggered back, his eyes wide, looking at the empty air where his gun used to be. He didn't understand. He looked at the machine like it was a beast that had just bitten him. "Physics," I whispered. I didn't give him time to process. I stood up from behind the console and slammed my palm against the big red button on the wall. Emergency quench. This wasn't an off switch. This was a catastrophic release. It severed the vacuum seal on the cryostat, exposing the liquid helium to the ambient atmosphere. Boom. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was an explosion of expansion. Liquid helium boils at minus 269 degrees Celsius. When it hits room temperature air, it expands 700 times its volume instantly. A massive column of white vapor erupted from the quench pipe at the top of the machine. It roared like a jet engine taking off in a closet. The pressure wave hit Cade, knocking him off his feet. The room vanished. The white fog from the CO2 was nothing compared to this. This was a blizzard. A total whiteout. The temperature plummeted. Frost crystallized instantly on the walls, on the glass, on my eyelashes. The roar was deafening. The expanding helium was displacing all the oxygen in the room. It was pushing the air out through the vents, through the cracks, replacing it with inert, freezing gas. Cade was on the floor, gasping. He was trying to breathe, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. But there was no air, only helium. He clawed at his throat. His face turned from red to purple, then to a pale, waxy blue. The hypoxia was instant. The cold was solidifying the fluid in his lungs. I stepped out of the control booth. I held my breath. I had one lung full of oxygen, maybe 45 seconds of consciousness. I walked through the freezing vapor. I looked like a ghost in the mist. Cade looked up at me. His eyes were freezing over, the corneas turning cloudy. He reached out with his good hand, a weak, trembling gesture. He wanted mercy. I looked down at him. I held the laryngoscope blade in my hand, a solid bar of austenitic, non-magnetic stainless steel. A spark triggers the manifold. A breath saves the monster. I had to end it. He tried to rise, a final spasm of survival. I drove the steel handle down, a precise, calculated strike to the trachea. Crunch. He collapsed. The fight went out of him. He lay still on the frost-covered floor, his chest hitching one last time before stopping forever. I stood up, my lungs burning for air. The roar of the quench was dying down, replaced by the hiss of settling frost. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the bone-deep vibration of what I'd just done. The monster was dead, not by a bullet, but by the very system he tried to destroy. The tactical team swarmed Zone 4. Men in hazmat suits moved through the dissipating fog with jerky, insect-like precision. They didn't speak to me. They didn't ask if I was okay. To them, I wasn't a survivor. I was a piece of evidence, contaminated but secured. They escorted me out to the staff lounge on the 3rd floor. The adrenaline dump hit me the moment I sat on the cheap vinyl sofa. It wasn't a slow decline, it was a violent crash. My hands started to shake, a rattling tremor I couldn't suppress. My teeth chattered, audible in the quiet room. It wasn't the cold from the helium. It was the chemistry of survival leaving my bloodstream. I pulled a grey wool blanket tight around my shoulders, staring at an old coffee stain on the carpet. The air here smelled of burnt brew and the lingering metallic scent of the chemical scrubbers they were already running downstairs. Bryce sat across from me. He looked smaller. The starch was gone from his coat, the arrogance erased from his face. He held a cup of water with both hands to keep it from spilling. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We had survived the physics, but now we had to survive the politics. The door opened. It wasn't a detective with a notepad. It wasn't a trauma counselor. It was a man in a charcoal grey suit. He was clean-shaven, smelling of expensive soap and legal ambiguity. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. I knew his species intimately. He was risk management. He was the antibody of the institution. He placed 2 thick folders on the coffee table. Miss Knox. Dr. Bryce, he said. His voice was smooth, devoid of any jagged edges. The situation has been contained. The hospital board is grateful for your resilience. He didn't say heroism. He said resilience. It was a safer word, less liability. However, he continued, sliding the folders across the low table, the nature of tonight's events involves sensitive infrastructure vulnerabilities. Public panic would be counterproductive. The hospital is prepared to offer a significant compensation package, inclusive of extended PTO and full mental health coverage, in exchange for your discretion. He tapped the document. The bold letters at the top read, Non-Disclosure Agreement and Waiver of Liability. It wasn't a thank you, it was a purchase order. They were buying our silence to keep the stock price from crashing. Bryce looked at the paper. He looked at the suit. Then he looked at me. For a second, I saw a flicker of the man he could have been, the man who might stand up and scream about the welded doors and the oxygen bomb, but then his eyes drifted to his ID badge on the table. He thought about his tenure. He thought about his mortgage. He thought about his medical license. He picked up the pen. "I understand," Bryce whispered. Scritch, scratch. The sound of the pen on paper was louder than the storm outside. It was the sound of a soul folding. The suit turned to me. "Miss Knox, this includes a guarantee of your full pension benefits, regardless of early retirement. My pension, my health insurance, the only wall standing between my LeFort vertebrae and a life of crippling debt." I looked at the hand that had held the laryngoscope. It was still trembling. I wasn't a crusader. I was just a tired woman with a bad back. Justice is a luxury. It is for people who can afford the deductibles. I took the pen. I signed my name. Vera Knox. The suit smiled, a tight, professional expression that didn't reach his eyes. He took the folders back immediately. The transaction was complete. The history of tonight had just been rewritten. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the emergency department exit. I had changed out of my scrubs. I wore my old grey parka and jeans. The blood was washed off my hands, but I could still feel the phantom cold of the helium mist on my skin. The rain was still falling, a relentless grey curtain that washed the city clean of its sins. The media vans were parked at the main entrance, lights flashing, reporters hungry for a story they would never get. I slipped out the side gate, invisible. I walked to the bus stop under the flickering street lamp. I was alone. I pressed 2 fingers to my radial artery. Thump, 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 thump. 60 beats per minute. Normal sinus rhythm. The bus pulled up, its air brakes hissing with a sound that reminded me of the CO2 canister. The doors folded open. I stepped up, swiping my pass. The driver didn't look at me. To him, I wasn't the woman who had just killed a man and saved a hospital. I was just another tired nurse coming off the night shift. I moved to the back seat and looked out the window as the hospital faded into the rain. The ghost was back in the machine, and the machine hummed on.